kept my face completely still. My daughter was still talking, something about the next chapter and what's best for everyone, but I had stopped hearing her words about 30 seconds in. I was looking at the folder she'd slid across my kitchen table. My kitchen table, the one I'd had since before she was born. The folder had a logo on the front. Sunrise Gardens. Retirement living for active seniors. There was a photo of an elderly man in a cardigan playing chess by a window. He looked comfortable. He looked like he had no idea where he was. I kept my face still and I thought, 63 years old. I still drove to the hardware store on my own. I still shoveled my own driveway every January. I still made my own coffee at 5:30 in the morning before anyone else in this house was awake. And my daughter who had moved her husband and 2 kids into my house 18 months ago after they lost their rental, had just handed me a brochure for a retirement home. I smiled. I said, "Thank you for thinking of me." She looked relieved. That was the part that stayed with me longest. My name is Victor, and I spent 31 years working pipeline inspection contracts across northern Alberta and British Columbia. It was not glamorous work. It was cold in ways the people who haven't done it cannot fully understand. And it kept me away from home for stretches that were too long and did real damage that took years to properly see. But it paid well. Very well when I was careful with it, which I was. My wife, Helen, and I bought our house in Kanata, West Ottawa, in 2003. 4 bedrooms, double garage, a backyard that backed onto a greenbelt. We paid it off in 11 years. Helen was a practical woman, and she kept meticulous records of everything. When she passed in the spring of 2019, she left behind a house that was fully ours, a small RRSP that she'd never touched, and a garden that I have been failing to maintain ever since, which he would have found both predictable and irritating. My daughter, I'll call her my daughter, because that is what she is, whatever else she has become, is 34. Her husband, Cody, is 37. They have 2 boys, 7 and 9, who are genuinely good kids and not responsible for any of this. They came to live with me in the spring of 2023. They had been renting a place in Barrhaven, and the landlord sold the property, and the rental market in Ottawa that year was what it was. And I said yes without hesitating because they were family, and the boys needed stability, and I had 4 bedrooms and no reason to say no. I want to be honest about the early months because I don't want to make myself sound like a saint. It was good in the beginning. The house had been very quiet since Helen died. I had learned to cook for one and eat without the television on and go to bed at a reasonable hour and not mind the silence, but I had not learned to like it. Having the boys here changed the quality of the air inside the house. There was noise and mess and someone always needing something, and I found that I had missed that without knowing it. I made space. I moved my office from the main 4-bedroom to the basement so they could have the room. I cleared out Helen's sewing room for the boys to share, and I took down her fabric organizers carefully and stored them in boxes that I labeled in her handwriting because I had found some of her old notes, and I couldn't quite bring myself to use my own. I helped with school pickups twice a week. I paid for the groceries most of the time because Cody was between contracts. He does audiovisual installation work, and my daughter was working part-time as a dental hygienist, and money was, as she often said, tight. None of that bothered me. That's the truth. None of it bothered me because they were my family, and the house was big, and I had the means, and it seemed like exactly the kind of thing a person was supposed to do with a paid-off house and retirement income and more space than they needed. What changed was gradual enough that I almost didn't see it. The first thing I noticed was the grocery receipts. I had been doing the big shop at Farm Boy on Hazeldane every Sunday, spending somewhere between $2.50 a week, which felt right for 5 people. Then one Sunday I came home and my daughter told me they'd switched to Costco and she'd already gone and spent $380, and could I e-transfer her my half? I did. I didn't say anything about the math. Then it happened again the following month. Then it was the utilities. She showed me the Hydro One bill and said we should split it 3 ways since we were all using the house. I agreed. Then it was the property tax. Same logic. I agreed to that too, though I remember thinking it was an unusual position to be in, paying a share of the taxes on a house I owned outright. Cody got a new contract in the fall, which was good. He was working again, driving out to Smiths Falls a few days a week for an installation job at a new hotel. I assumed things would normalize. They didn't, quite. The splitting continued. The requests continued. What changed was the framing. It shifted slowly from, "we're struggling," to, "this is just how we do things in this house." As if the arrangement had always existed, and I simply hadn't noticed. By Christmas of last year, I was covering significantly more than my share of the household expenses, while also owning the asset everyone was living inside of. And I had begun to feel, in a way I couldn't fully articulate yet, like a tenant in my own home. I turned 63 in February. My birthday falls on a Saturday that year, which felt like a small gift in itself. My old colleague Bert. We worked the same inspection circuit for 12 years, and he is one of those people who stays in your life without requiring maintenance. Called in the morning, and we talked for an hour about nothing important. My daughter made pancakes. The boys gave me a card they had drawn themselves, which I folded carefully and put in my desk drawer. It was a genuinely good morning. After lunch, my daughter sat down across from me at the kitchen table. Cody sat beside her. That should have told me something. The arrangement of it, the way they'd clearly discussed the seating beforehand. She said they wanted to talk about the future, about long-term plans, about making sure everyone was taken care of. I said I was listening. She slid the folder across the table. Sunrise Gardens. She printed out the information herself, I realized. It wasn't a brochure they'd mailed for. She'd gone looking. She talked about how the community was excellent, how there was a pool and a workshop and organized trips, how I'd have my own space and my own routine, and it would be so much less for me to manage than a 4-bedroom house. Cody said something about how the housing market in Ottawa was really moving, and how it made sense to think about equity while it was strong. There it was. Underneath the wellness language and the soft concern, there it was. I looked at the folder. I thought about Helen folding fabric in the room that now held 2 sets of bunk beds. I thought about the driveway I had shoveled approximately 200 times since moving in. I thought about the mortgage documents I had signed in 2003 and the final payment receipt I had framed as a joke and hung in the garage, and whether it was actually that funny. I smiled. I said, "Thank you for thinking of me." My daughter touched my hand. She said she knew it was a lot to consider. She said there was no rush. I said I needed some air, and I went out to the garage and stood there for a while in the cold with the lights off. I did not call a lawyer that day. I want to explain why, because I've thought about it since and I think I understand it now. It wasn't naivety. I knew what the conversation had been about. I knew the shape of it, but I am 63 years old and she is my daughter, and I had spent 31 years making hard decisions, quickly, in difficult conditions, and I had learned eventually that the decisions you make in the first hour of a shock are not always the ones you want to live with. So, I waited. I watched. I started paying closer attention to things I had previously allowed to go unexamined. What I found over the following 6 weeks was clarifying. I found in the filing cabinet where I kept household documents that my daughter had requested a property tax reassessment form in my name. She had not asked me. The form had not been submitted, but it had been filled out in pencil, in handwriting that was not mine. I found, in a conversation I was not meant to hear. Cody on the phone in the backyard saying the words, "once it goes to probate," in a tone that was businesslike and unhurried. He was talking to someone about timelines. I did not hear the full conversation. I heard enough. I found that my daughter had, at some point in the past year, added herself as an emergency contact to 3 of my financial accounts, not as power of attorney, not with my formal authorization, but listed informally in places where a name can sometimes be inserted without the primary account holder being notified. None of these things, individually, would have held up as evidence of anything in particular. Together, they formed a picture I could not look away from. I called a lawyer named Sandra, who had been recommended to me by Bert's wife, who had used her during a difficult estate situation 3 years prior. I met with Sandra on a Tuesday afternoon at her office, near Tunney's pasture, and I laid out everything I had documented, the expense-splitting arrangement, the brochure, the overheard call, the filing cabinet. Sandra listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she told me that what I had described was not uncommon. She used the phrase financial elder pressure, which I had not heard before. She told me that my position was actually quite strong. The house was solely in my name. There was no joint ownership, and the informal additions to financial accounts could be reversed cleanly. She told me what I needed to do and in what order, and I went home and did it. Over the next 3 weeks, I quietly updated my accounts and removed the informal contacts. I had a new will drawn up, which Sandra's office handled, and I changed my power of attorney to Bert, who agreed without asking a single intrusive question. I made sure every document that needed to be current was current. I did all of this without my daughter knowing, which felt strange and sad and necessary. I did not tell her what I was doing. I went on making coffee at 5:30 and shoveling the driveway and picking up the boys on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I cooked dinner on the night she worked late. I did not avoid Cody or treat him coldly. I needed them to see no change in me because I had not yet decided what I was going to do with what I knew, and I needed time to make that decision properly. The thing that made it for me was a Wednesday evening in late March. I had come home from a walk. I do 5 kilometers most evenings along the Greenbelt path, and I had been doing it since Helen died as a way of staying in my own body, and the back door was slightly ajar, which I thought nothing of. I came to the kitchen, and I heard Cody and my daughter talking in the living room. I would have gone upstairs if I'd heard what they were saying any sooner. What I caught was my daughter saying, "He'll be fine. He doesn't really need the space. He just thinks he does. Once he's somewhere with people his own age, he'll be happier." And Cody said, "And the market timing is genuinely good right now. We should try to move on this before summer." I stood in the hallway for a moment with my jacket still on and my keys in my hand. I thought of a lot of things. I thought of the overtime shifts I had worked in, -40 weather in Fort St. John when she was 12 because she wanted to do competitive skating and the rink fees were not cheap. I thought of the university tuition I had paid in full so she would not begin her adult life with debt. I thought of the February afternoons I had driven 2 hours in an ice storm to see her perform in the school production that lasted 40 minutes. I thought of all the ordinary, unremarkable things I had done for her over 34 years, because that was what you did when someone was yours. And then I thought, I am 63 years old, and I own this house, and I am standing in my hallway, and my daughter is in my living room discussing the timing of my removal. I went upstairs. I did not say anything that evening. I made tea. I watched the news. I said goodnight to the boys. But I had made my decision. I did not throw them out. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to me how this part is understood. I did not act in anger, and I did not make them homeless. What I did was write my daughter a letter, a real letter, on paper, because that was how I wanted her to receive it, and leave it on the kitchen table on a Saturday morning before anyone was up. The letter said that I had decided the current living arrangement was no longer working for me. It said I was grateful for the time we had shared in this house, and that I loved her and the boys without reservation and would continue to do so. It said that I was giving her and her family 90 days to make alternative arrangements, which was more than the legal requirement and which I hoped would be sufficient. It said that the house would remain my house, now and in the future, and that any further conversations suggesting otherwise were not ones I would be participating in. It said, at the end, that I hoped we could find our way back to something honest, but that I needed honesty first. I poured myself a coffee and I sat in the backyard in my coat, and I waited. She found the letter at 8:15. I heard the back door open about 10 minutes later. I heard her come out onto the deck. She stood there for a moment. She said, "Dad." I said, "Good morning." She said, how long have you?" And then she stopped. I said, "I think you know when." She sat down on the other chair, the one that had been Helen's. For a long time, neither of us said anything. A chickadee landed on the feeder I put up in November and sat there looking at us. She said, "I don't know what Cody was thinking." I said, "I think you do." She looked at her hands. She said quietly, "We were scared. The rent in this city is impossible, and we thought," and then she stopped again. I said, "I know you were scared. I understand that, but you were sitting in my house that I paid for, and you were planning around me instead of talking to me. You treated me like an obstacle." She didn't say anything. I said, "I'm your father. I'm not an obstacle." The boys came out about 20 minutes later, still in their pajamas, wanting to know if anyone was making breakfast. My older grandson leaned against my arm the way he does, heavy and unself-conscious, and I put my arm around him and held him there. I made scrambled eggs and toast for all of us. Cody came down and sat quietly at the table and ate and said thank you when I passed him the juice. He knew. My daughter and I did not resolve everything over breakfast. That would take longer, and some parts of it are still ongoing. But we sat at the table together and ate, and the boys told me about something funny that had happened at school, and the light came through the kitchen window the way it does on a clear March morning, sharp and clean. They were out by June. My daughter found a 2-bedroom apartment in Stittsville with a school that worked for the boys. Cody landed a longer contract. Things for them were manageable, which I had always believed they would be, if I'm honest. The urgency had never been entirely real. Bert helped me move my office back upstairs on a Saturday in July. We carried the desk up from the basement and put it by the window, where I could see the backyard, and then we drove to the bridgehead on Richmond Road and had lunch and talked for 3 hours about fishing and property prices, and whether the senators were ever going to get their act together, which is a conversation Bert and I have been having since 2007 and shows no sign of concluding. My daughter calls on Sundays. It took a few months to get there, but she calls now and we talk. It is not the same as it was. I am not sure it should be the same, but it is real, which is something I value more than I once understood that I did. The boys came for a weekend in August, and we built a raised garden bed in the backyard because I had been meaning to do something about Helen's garden, and I didn't want to do it alone. My older grandson chose tomatoes. My younger one chose something called a dragon carrot because he liked the name, which seemed like a perfectly good reason. I go to bed at a reasonable hour. I shovel my own driveway. I make my own coffee at 5:30 in the morning before anyone else is awake, except now there is no one else, and the quiet is a kind I chose, which makes it entirely different. The brochure is still in the folder on my desk. I kept it. Some mornings I look at it. The man in the cardigan, the window, the chessboard, and I think about all the different ways a person can disappear while still being technically present. And then I get up and I go about my day, in my house, on my terms, with my name on the deed and my coffee in my hand, and every year I have left still fully mine to decide what to do with. I still have that brochure. It's sitting in a folder on my desk right now, next to the window that looks out over the backyard where 2 boys once helped me plant tomatoes and dragon carrots on a Saturday afternoon in August. I don't keep it out of bitterness. I keep it because it reminds me of something I almost missed about myself, that I had let things slide so far, so quietly, that someone who grew up in this house felt comfortable handing me a pamphlet about leaving it. That's the part I had to sit with longest. Not what my daughter did, but how I had made it possible. For 18 months I had absorbed the expense splitting and the quiet restructuring and the language that slowly repositioned me as a guest in my own home, and I had done it because I loved her and I didn't want conflict, and I told myself it was all manageable. That's not generosity. That's avoidance, dressed up as patience. There's a difference, and I think the clearest sign of a person's judgment, real judgment, not just intelligence, is knowing which one you're actually doing. When I finally sat down with Sandra and laid everything out on that table in her office near Tooney's pasture, I wasn't angry anymore. I was clear. That clarity was the thing I had been missing. I had all the information I needed for months. The reassessment form in pencil, the phone call about probate, the informal contacts on my accounts. But information without the willingness to act on it honestly is just worry. Wisdom isn't what you know. It's what you're prepared to do with what you know, even when the person involved is someone you love. The letter I left on the kitchen table that Saturday morning was the hardest thing I've written since Helen's eulogy. I rewrote it 4 times. Not because I wasn't sure of what I was doing, but because I wanted it to be true, not just accurate, but fair. I wanted my daughter to be able to read it and not find a single sentence she could call cruel. That discipline, the refusal to wound even when you have been wounded, is not weakness. It is the opposite of weakness. It is the thing that makes it possible to still have Sunday phone calls and grandchildren who lean against your arm like it's the most natural place in the world to be. What I understand now, that I did not fully understand at 62, is that love without self-respect is not actually love. It's a transaction waiting to go wrong. Victor, who absorbed everything quietly, was not being a good father. He was being a convenient one, and the cost of convenience, in my case, was that my daughter stopped seeing me as a person with standing and started seeing me as a problem to be managed. That is what happens when we make ourselves too small for too long. People stop accounting for the space we're not taking up. Erd helped me carry my desk back upstairs on a Saturday in July. We didn't talk about any of it. We just carried the desk, and then we went for lunch, and he let me pay because he knew I needed to. That is what 40 years of honest friendship looks like. You don't need a crisis to prove it's real. You just need someone who shows up with a truck and doesn't ask unnecessary questions. I made my own choices, finally. And they cost me something, and they gave me something back that was worth considerably more.